It's just something we say to each other to make ourselves feel like we're doing something. But the reality is, if you actually wanted to do politicians' climate promises, this would be phenomenally expensive. Just to give you one data point, so a new study in Nature shows that if you get close to, not actually to Biden's net zero by 2050, which is equivalent to what the European Union has promised by 2050, if you do that in the smartest possible way, the cost will be equivalent to about $11,000 in cost per person per year by 2050. I think we can safely say most people are going to say, fuck no, I'm not going to pay that amount of money. And so we need to get a realization that the current set of promises can only work as long as the politician can say they will do it, but not actually doing it. But if we start trying to do it, most people are just going to instantly rebel and say, no, I'm not going to vote for you. And that's, of course, why Biden is having troubles now, and why it's very unlikely we're going to get to 2030 without a lot of upheaval within the European Union.
That was my other question, because I'd like to use your background as basically a social scientist. What we see here in the Czech Republic, climate and any measure against climate change or tackling climate change has never, ever been a topic of any election. The Green Party, which is, let's say, radical left, is low, like 1-2%
actually
result.
0.99.
Actually, zero less, and they're getting less and less. But people are beginning to see quite drastic price increases in electricity due to all these measures, and I would suspect this would lead, as we saw in France with how do you call it in English?
Yellow vest.
Yellow vest. To a very I would say forceful backlash again politically. And so what is the solution? Isn't there like a one world that is people flying with private jets to big conferences and saying, okay, we'll do this and we'll do that, and we have great speeches. But on the other hand, on the very basic structure of how we view democracy, that is the majority vote, there is no work being done except for maybe scaremongering and alarming, you'll die in 10 years, and which is getting people who should support something basically scared to their death and rejecting this thing as a whole.
Yeah. So I think there's two parts of this conversation. One is, as you point out, the scaring people to death. A lot of this is because this is going to be very, very expensive in the standard setup. And obviously people are going to say no, unless you convince them this is the end of the world, right? I mean, if you say, would you rather die and all your family and everybody you know and everyone in the known universe dies a horrible death, or that you pay $11,000 per person per year? Then, $11,000 may not sound all that bad after all. And that's why it's important to say, look, this is not the end of the world. It is a problem. So the UN estimate that this will cost us, say, by the end of the century, some 3-4% of GDP. Remember, by 2100, each person on the planet will probably be in the order of 450% as rich as he or she is today. So instead of being 450% as rich, we'll only be 434% as rich. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. And that's, of course, the background to have this conversation that most people are actually going to say, hell no, I'm not going to pay that much for your policies. That's why we need to have a conversation about how do you do smarter policies. Now, one way to do, and so I have 5 things in the book that I talk about that are smart climate policies. One is a carbon tax. So any climate economist will tell you you should tax bad stuff. And it's a surefire way of getting the most effective way of cutting CO2. Now, carbon taxes, no taxes are popular, but actually carbon taxes can also avoid other taxes that you need to have. And so if you do it smartly, they can actually be a net benefit for your society because you still raise funds, but you do it by taxing bads instead of goods. That could be a good idea. Realistically, we're only going to solve a smaller part of the problem with climate change. And of course, realistically, we're not going to do all that well on it because almost nobody has done climate policy very well anywhere in the world. But that's only a smaller part of the solution. The main part of the solution is going to be innovation. So fundamentally, humankind has never solved problems, but big social problems, by saying, sure, I'll feel worse about everything. You don't win elections by telling everyone, I'm sorry, could you be a little colder, a little less comfortable, drive a little less, have a little less meat, and be a little poor? That's just not a good way to win an election, right? And if you think back in the 1970s, we worried a lot. I was just growing up there. We worried a lot about starvation and people not getting enough food. And I remember my mom telling me, you have to finish up your plate because, all those hungry kids down in Africa wouldn't, which never quite made any sense to me, right? But the basic point, of course, is we couldn't solve starvation problems by eating a little less in the rich world and then sending down our food to Africa. That's not how that works. How we did solve it was through the Green Revolution, basically the set of innovations that allowed us, basically with much higher yielding varieties of wheat and other grains, to grow much, much more food on every hectare. If you get those kinds of wonder grains, people will just sow them everywhere and everybody will produce a lot more food and everyone will be much happier. That's how technology works. Instead of trying to make it a solution where everybody has to starve a little bit, which is not going to win you in elections, you come up with a technological innovation that means everyone can have much more virtually at no cost. That's the way you solve problems. The same way with climate. Instead of telling everyone, I'm sorry, you have to do less, you have to be colder, you have to be poorer, you do this with innovation. And let me just give you one example. So, right now, nuclear power, it's not unsafe, but it's just fairly expensive, especially if you build new nuclear power plants. Phenomenally expensive. And there's a lot of reasons that we could go into later on. But, fundamentally, that's not the way to go. There's a lot of people who argue the next generation, what's kind of called the fourth generation nuclear power plants, could be incredibly cheap. Let's just assume that, Bill Gates and many others are investing in this. Let's just assume that they can actually make that happen. So they're incredibly safe, they're modular, they're small, and they're incredibly cheap. Everyone will buy them and we'll be done with climate change. The point here is not to say that I think nuclear is going to solve this. Nuclear is one way this could be solved, but that depends on what the technology turns out to be. But the point is, if we develop something that is low or zero carbon and cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch. If we don't, we will not fix this problem because we'll keep having all these politicians promising stuff that they won't get reelected delivering.